Hi there, my name's Craig and I'm here at the Old Mackinac Point Lighthouse in Mackinac City. And today I'd like to not only take you up the lighthouse tower, but talk a little bit more about how a lighthouse works, what the duties of the lighthouse keepers were, and why people built lighthouses in the first place. Now, something that's really important to remember about not just the lighthouse here at Old Mackinac Point, but lighthouses all over the world, is that they're all trying to send a message to sailors out there on the water. And usually that message is stay away. Don't come over here because there's something dangerous here. Here at Old Mackinac Point, Congress decided in 1889 that they needed a lighthouse here to mark this protruding point of land. Old Mackinac Point is about as far north as you can go in the lower peninsula of Michigan. And so if you were sailing out there in the Straits of Mackinac, especially if you were sailing out of the west, out of Lake Michigan, there was a chance that you might try and cut off this corner and you'd run aground here on Old Mackinac Point. So Congress wanted to prevent that from happening. So again, in 1889, authorized the construction of a light station here at Old Mackinac Point. The first building went up in 1890, and the lighthouse itself, the building where I'm standing right now, was completed and the light was lit for the very first time in 1892. Now, lighthouses all over the world use a variety of means to send that message, telling sailors to stay away and to stay safe. They use sound. Today they might use radio beacons, but kind of the big obvious method of sending that message is light. It's called a lighthouse. And so what we have here is the Fresnel lens that would have been mounted up at the top of the lighthouse tower. Now, these lenses are named after Augustin Fresnel, the French physicist who invented this style of lens early in the 19th century. And these Fresnel lenses use a variety of prisms to bend and magnify light. Now, as you look at our lens here, this is actually a fourth order lens. Fresnel invented 7 different standard sizes of lenses. Those are called orders of lenses, and this is a fourth order lens. That means that it's kind of medium small, so it's actually not very big, but the prisms on this lens could actually bend and magnify the light from either just a simple oil lamp or just a single light bulb and turn it into something that would be visible for about 16 miles out there on the Straits of Mackinac. Now, as you look at this lens, you'll see a couple of different components. On the tops and bottoms, there are curved prisms. Again, those are bending light that's going up and down and focusing it back towards the horizontal. And then around the center, there's a belt of big bullseye lenses. That's sometimes called a flash panel. You can imagine that like a series of magnifying glasses stacked on top of one another. And that is taking the light that's shooting straight out from the sides of the light source and really amplifying it, focusing it into a horizontal beam. So those flash panels, the prisms above and below it, again, create a concentrated beam of light shooting out there into the darkness. Now, this lens, as you might be able to see, has multiple flash panels, multiple sets of prisms, and that's because this lens, like most Fresnel lenses in most lighthouses around the world, actually generates not just one beam of light, but several, all at one time. Now, you may notice that our lens is actually mounted on a very large brass gear. That's because the whole assembly is supposed to be rotating around. So you could potentially imagine multiple fingers or beams of light shooting out of each one of these flash panels. So now that we've had a chance to take a closer look at the lens itself, keep all this in mind. Remember, this would be up at the top of the tower where we're headed next, but we'll step into the service room and actually start our climb up the tower. So before we actually climb up the tower, we're going to pause here in the service room. And this is a place that both lighthouse keepers would have had access to essentially all of the time. Now keep in mind that the keepers' quarters that we're standing in right now was a duplex. There were always at least 2 lighthouse keepers and their families living here. Both the keepers had access to this space, and they probably used it as a base of operations for everything that was going to go on up at the top of the tower. We know there was a small workbench in here, so they could have used this room to clean and maintain some of the various equipment, but most of their time actually would have been spent up there with the light itself. So we're going to climb this spiral staircase right here behind me. There are 51 steps in that spiral staircase. It's going to take us up about 4 stories. So this is actually a relatively short lighthouse compared to some others on the Great Lakes, and especially compared to lighthouses out on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Now, as you get near the top of this spiral staircase, there is a low spot. The keepers would have had to duck under it to get up into the watchroom. We today have to duck under as well. But with that, let's start our climb up the tower. Well, we've made it most of the way up the tower, and we are now in the watchroom. Whenever the light was going up on the next level up in the lantern room, one of those 2 lighthouse keepers would have to be standing watch, and they could do that in this space. The watchroom saved them the trip. They didn't have to run up and down that staircase anytime they needed to come up here to tend to the lens. Now, standing watch is probably pretty boring. There's not a whole lot to actually do, but the keepers did still have 2 major responsibilities at night when they were on watch. One of them is to make sure that the light itself is still on. Now, when this lighthouse first went into operation in 1892, there was just an oil lamp inside that lens that we were looking at downstairs. That oil lamp, very similar to something you might have at home right now. The keepers needed to make sure that the lamp had enough fuel in it and that it was burning brightly. A little bit later on, in 1913, the illumination source was switched to something called incandescent oil vapor. It used to compress gas, so it was kind of like a Coleman camping lantern. Again, the keepers needed to make sure that the fuel was flowing freely and that everything was burning brightly. And then in 1929, the light source changed again to just a regular old light bulb, very similar to what you've got in your lamps right now. And in all of those cases, the keepers needed to make sure that that light was on, burning brightly. The other main thing that they had to keep a lookout for when they're standing on watch is that the lens itself was rotating. Remember, the lens is mounted on that big brass gear. The whole assembly is designed to spin around. That generates those multiple beams or fingers of light. And as those fingers spin, if you're out on a boat in the Straits of Mackinac, you can only see one of those fingers at a time. And by altering the arrangement of the flash panels or prisms in that lens and altering the speed at which the lens rotates, you can create a variety of different unique light signatures. That's how you tell lighthouses apart. If they all had just one light kind of spinning around lazily, it'd get pretty confusing, especially in a place like the Straits of Mackinac, where there are a lot of lighthouses in a pretty small space. And so here at Old Mackinac Point, the lens would rotate at a speed that would make it appear to flash on and off once every 10 seconds. Now, in addition to how long it would take between flashes, you could also change the color of the light. A lot of lights were white, which just meant that it was just the color of the flame or the light bulb inside it. But you could also make red or green lights. And here at Old Mackinac Point, when the lighthouse opened in 1892, the light was red. They put a red glass chimney on that oil lamp. So if you saw a red light flashing once every 10 seconds, you knew you were looking at Old Mackinac Point. A little bit later on, as they switched some of the light sources, the color here at Old Mackinac Point actually changed from red to white, but it still maintained that same 10-second flashing sequence. Now, the rotation of that lens was powered by clockwork. It actually worked very similar to a cuckoo clock or a grandfather clock. There were weights hanging all the way down from the top of the tower down through the center of that staircase that we just climbed up, and they were attached to this clockwork mechanism. And as those weights descended, pulling on a wire rope that passed up through the watchroom, up into the lantern room, it spun those gears, which in turn spun the lens around. So the keepers had to make sure that all that was working freely. They also had to rewind that clockwork mechanism periodically. And they continued using that clockwork drive until 1940. At that point, they replaced it with just a regular electric motor, but the job remained the same. The keepers needed to make sure that everything was spinning smoothly. So apart from making sure the light is on and that it's spinning around correctly, again, there's not a whole lot to do when they're actually standing watch. We don't really know how the keepers split up the night. If one of the keepers worked the first 4 or 5 hours and the second keeper worked the second 4 or 5 hours, it's kind of unclear. We do just know that they were standing watch. But if standing watch was relatively boring, as soon as the sun would come up in the morning, there was a lot more work to do. So the keepers would climb up this ladder into the lantern room and start to take care of the lens. We'll talk a little bit more about that work and everything else the keepers had to do up in the lantern room. Well, we've made it all the way up to the top of the tower, and now we are in the lantern room. So that whole lens assembly, the green table that it's mounted on that we looked at downstairs, that would all be up here. And it would actually take up most of the space here in the lantern room. There was, however, still definitely enough room for the keepers to get up here and work on the lens. And they would start to do that almost as soon as the sun came up in the morning. They'd come up here out of the watch room, they'd hang up curtains on all the windows. They wanted to protect the lens from UV rays in the sun, and then they'd actually start to clean the lens. And they might spend a few hours doing that. They had a variety of different buffing compounds and cleaning supplies that they could use to clean that lens. They were never supposed to touch it with their bare hands. They wanted to make sure that it was completely free of blemishes. Those of you who wear glasses, or if you've ever worn sunglasses, you can understand how much just something as small as a speck of dust or a fingerprint can really impact the quality of light coming through that lens, and the same applied to that big lens up here. They wanted it to be completely clean to ensure that the highest quality of light was going out there towards the straights. After the lens itself was cleaned, they would make sure the light source was cleaned and fueled up. Initially with that oil lamp, they had a variety of very small tools that they could use to make sure there was no soot or anything like that. And the idea behind spending all this time working on the lens and the light source was that they didn't have to do it later. They didn't want to wait until the sun was setting or a storm was rolling in to come up here and try and get the lens ready to go. They just wanted to turn it on so they could start sending that signal out as soon as possible. Now, once the lens and everything inside was taken care of, they could turn their attention to everything else. They might have gone out on the catwalk that surrounds the lantern room here and washed these windows. They probably would have spent a great deal of time over in the fog signal building. There would have been 2 large boilers in there, so you can imagine essentially steam locomotives without wheels inside that building, and that's all there to power the fog whistle. So just like the light sends out that stay away symbol, if there were times when the light wasn't visible, so for instance, if it were foggy, if it were snowing very heavily, there were times we know when there was too much smoke in the air, there were forest fires in this area. Whenever the light itself wouldn't have been visible, they turned it to sound to send that stay away message, and they used that fog signal over in the fog signal building. So those boilers needed constant attention, all of the machinery associated with the whistle needed constant attention. Once that was done, there's still the rest of the station to take care of. There are several other buildings here on the grounds. The grounds themselves need to be maintained. There's always something to be painted, always something to be cleaned. So those keepers kept very busy. Their families may have helped them out with some of these chores, but by and large, it fell to those 2 men to keep all of this up. So that work that the keepers are doing, while boring, it is very necessary because the Straits of Mackinac out here are a pretty dangerous place. It's a narrow, constricted waterway, so there's a lot of traffic passing back and forth through there. Collisions could happen very easily. The water goes from being very deep to very shallow very quickly, so it's very easy to run aground. The weather here in the Straits of Mackinac can change very, very quickly. And there's also not really a good place to seek shelter if trouble does arise, especially out to the west there in Lake Michigan. There aren't really good, safe anchorages here in the Straits. So that work that the keepers are doing here, although it might be boring, it is very necessary because they're sending out that message trying to warn sailors about the dangers here at Old Mackinac Point. And the keepers sent out that message every day for about 65 years, at least until 1957. That's when the Mackinac Bridge opened. Now I mentioned we're up just about 55 feet. The focal plane for this lighthouse was about 55 feet off the ground. The white towers on the bridge out there are over 500 feet tall, so they are 10 times as tall as this lighthouse tower. The bridge is covered with lights, it has its own fog signals, and as a result, it made this lighthouse obsolete. So Old Mackinac Point was decommissioned in 1957. There are still several other lighthouses here in the Straits of Mackinac that are active. At one time, there were as many as 14 lighthouses that were active in this area. Many of them are still active lights today. Now, there aren't lighthouse keepers anymore, everything is automated, but the Coast Guard does still maintain those lights, so they have automated light signals, they have automated fog signals, and so if you're a semi-competent sailor, you could still navigate through the Straits of Mackinac here just using light and sound, just like sailors were doing well over 100 years ago. Now that's just a quick look at the lighthouse and the tower, the work that the keepers were doing. Again, all of that work that they're doing is to send out that signal to stay away. And again, that's what lighthouses all around the world are doing. They are sending that message. I hope you've enjoyed our tower tour and also hope to see you here at Old Mackinac Point sometime in the future.
Thank you.